pessimism is moral cowardice. Too often today, people are ready to tell us, this is not possible, that is not possible. I say, whatever the true interest of our country calls for is always possible. We have nothing to fear but our own doubts. That was said by Enoch Powell at the Conservative Party conference in 1968. Modern pessimists of all kind, religious or otherwise, delude themselves in one respect. They think they're rational. The pessimist imagines that he stands alone, rigidly, even stoically, against the tumult of modernity. He stands on the cliff and with the aged wisdom of youth convinces himself that doom, hopelessness and eternal woe are his only companions. What can we do but knowingly smile and gently guide this senile adolescent away from the cliff edge? The belief that life in modernity is meaningless would cause lesser men to succumb to that trite state of ennui which has rightly become the object of scathing parody in our times. The weak-willed and the vain gaze at themselves in a cracked mirror, but also watch the scene from above as some detached televisual spectacle. The alleged conclusion that modern life is meaningless, that man is an ape with just enough consciousness to produce self-image, and yet not enough consciousness to see some absolute truth and meaning, is not a conclusion at all. Indeed, the statement, everything is meaningless, warrants the response, so what? Inherent meaninglessness is not a conclusion of thought, but a proposition, and it is seared onto the minds of nihilists with the certitude of an axiom. Pessimism from angsty introspection is so common because it is desired, not because it is justified. Many overstep their self-watching and brooding to leap into religion. However, in embracing faith and the esoteric, their bizarre secular pessimism is simply concealed with incense and opaque mysteries. Catholic reactionaries often claim that Western civilization is Catholicism. They deride post- or pre-Christian culture as atheistic degeneracy, or, God help them, pagan barbarism. The Punchable Belloc wrote as much. They argue that Western civilization is in decline because the West has lost its Christianity. It never occurs to them that the Mother Church did not bear Western civilization, but that the Church was born itself of Western civilization. If the reactionary asserts that Western civilization is the Church, then the reactionary must also deny that the classical world was at all a part of Western civilization. He must say that the Roman and the Mediterranean experience had no connection whatsoever with Western civilization. Even if adopting a variation of Spengler's Apollonian against Faustian partition, the death of Christian Western civilization is not the death of high culture or civilization. There is a period of pre-Christian culture and civilization which rivals our own, and so the prospect of glory and transcendence is not denied by the collapse of the Church. Post-Christian, post-Western civilization can climb to and exceed the heights of pre-Christian civilization. The only thing preventing it in us is ourselves. We only have to fear our own doubts. We must overleap the Church. A typical response to this from the Catholic reactionaries is to say, but Christianity was a perfection of the incomplete classical world. By arguing that firstly the classical world was an embryonic Christianity, the slippery argument of Belloc and Chesterton, and secondly that the West is the Church, the Catholic implies that the classical world was Christian Western civilization. He implies that the West was Christian before the birth of Christ. These are the type of mental arabesques that are cast in defence of the Church. Such a position is insidious because it denies the possibility of a post-Christian civilization in the West. This denial of a future without the Church is misplaced pessimism and nothing more. The misplaced pessimism of Catholic reactionaries comes from their obsession with martyrdom and the cross. Indeed, many indulge themselves in pessimism and despair. There's also a certain pride, although denied, that actuates the Catholic reactionary. He is proud to be among Guénon's elect, proud to be one of the last men clutching to a broken faith. He secretly longs for a new dark age, so that he can slip out from the world and live on some barren island. His Elysium is Skellig Michael. This sort of religious escapism serves his ego well, but his civilization poorly. If we allow rightist thinking to follow the religious reactionaries to their barren island of despair, we will become nothing more than an empty gesture, martyrs of a dying faith. Many of these people are content to melt into their seats and smile dumbly as the West crumbles. We must tear down the crumbling palaces so that we can rebuild a new world of our own design. Pessimists of faith, put down thy cross and take up thy sledgehammer. Traditionalist pessimists view the descent of the West as a descent of an ideal. This is not, however, a linear and teleological descent, a mere inverse of the optimistic liberal, because traditionalists are often perennialist, and they believe in a cyclical history. Given such a cyclical view, and that the traditionalist pessimist believes he lives in the Kali Yuga, the lower stage of the cycle, he has no reason to be pessimistic. He should be optimistic. The time for pessimism is at high tide, since the tide can only recede. Even if they believe we have many further years of unwinding, in the long run, the future will be inevitably greater than the present. He may feel alienation, but not pessimism. The great and justified pessimist of history was Cato the Younger. The solitary Cato paused on the sands of Rome and gazed out at the abating tide. He could feel the changing of that tide, and he could see the Rome that he cherished being carried out to sea. Cato, as the reactionaries of today, did not live in his time, instead escaping to and embodying a romanticised past. Cato's pessimism reverberated throughout Roman history, and his suicide was the suicide of the Republic, a botched failure by a wounded and exhausted man. Cato lived and died a true pessimist, but this pessimism was not a consequence of senility or delirium. The psychological delirium of that generation was not the pessimistic reaction of the aristocrats, but the plebeian optimism of the demagogues. Necessarily, the traditionalist who subscribes to a cyclical or tidal view of history must be optimistic in the lowest age. The time for optimism is at low tide, since the future guarantees a rising tide. The pessimist that believes he is in the Kali Yuga must either justify his pessimism by extrapolating historical decline into the future linearly and indefinitely, and in doing so discard the entire cyclical history of the Yugas, or claim that he lives in the closing stages of the highest age, rather than in the lowest stage. Accepting either of these forces the pessimist to abandon the theory which was the basis of his pessimism in the first place. Pessimists reject boisterous optimism in the age when it is most justified, because they are often incapable of authentic joy. They have a poor constitution, missing both gut and spine. They shrink from action in fear of failure, and they daren't hope, dreading that they might one day be pleasantly surprised. The pessimist then is a cowardly suicidal, a man who hates his life and yet clings to it. His fear of death sustains him, not his joy of life. He longs for the death of his society, but he is too cowardly to destroy it. And he is too exhausted to change it, even if he wanted to. The pessimist chooses passive nihilism and satisfies himself watching his society crumble around him as some estranged spectacle. This phenomenon is not restricted to reactionaries, though, and can also be found in left communism, or Posadism to an extent. The pessimism of both left communists and reactionaries is ultimately a psychological one, and the novelty of their ideologies are products of unusual feelings and not of unusual thoughts. The disposition to pessimism, rational or not in the circumstances, slouches towards certain ideologies which rationalise it. Bordegger's belief in spontaneous revolution can be contrasted to Spengler's belief in spontaneous Caesarism. Both men were pessimists, and both offered only passivity. The call to inaction is the grand whimper of the pessimist, whether communist or reactionary. Now, there are two figures in contemporary rightist fringe thinking which almost go together dialectically, which are Guénon and Evelyn. Now, Guénon revealed the crisis of the modern world, and Evelyn revolted against it. However, Evelyn turned away from modernity in revulsion and not in revolt. There is a tendency for traditionalists to excuse themselves from the modern world as a man moves away from a bad smell. They, as Coriolanus, turn their backs on a modernity that has rejected them. What many imagine to be a revolt against is simply a flight from the modern world. Many decide that they will turn inward, as St. Augustine in the unwinding of the Roman Empire, hoping to find some refuge there. It is often the case that they turn towards esoteric mysticism and magical nonsense. There is a simple comfort to such vague mysteries, and the initiate can spend many years staring into a muddy puddle. Indeed, he imagines this muddy puddle to be deep, sacred even, simply because it is opaque. When a passerby steps on the puddle, revealing its shallowness, the initiate concludes that the man's shoe, on account of its shoeness, was unable to penetrate the mysteries of the puddle. The great plague of the right is not capitalism, not Catholicism or atheism, not even socialism, but pessimism, which drips into our minds regardless of ideology. The right can be unified in pursuit of a goal, and those in the ranks of the future vanguard will share that unified vision. All European religions and all European ideological sensibilities will be subsumed under the sublime unity of the vanguard. We will stop purging each other and instead purge pessimism from ourselves, because once we have rid ourselves of doubt and pessimism, only then can we purify our society from doubt and pessimism. Attempts to restore some half-remembered dream are deleterious spasms of pessimism that must be avoided. We are all part of the modern world. We are all in this together. The task of the future vanguard is not to reject the modern world outright, but to seize a modernity that has been taken away from us.